pursue my goals dry than otherwise.
For more than 4 decades, Gordon Lightfoot stood at the center of Canadian music. From the 1960s onward, his voice dominated radio waves, concert halls, and the national imagination. He was not just successful, he was untouchable, a songwriter trusted to tell Canada who it was and how it felt. Yet dominance does not mean peace. Behind the long reign and the quiet authority lived a man who never forgot the moments when respect was denied. While the public heard calm melodies and steady words, Lightfoot absorbed betrayals, dismissals, and silent humiliations that never reached the headlines. Near the end of his life, he no longer softened the truth. There were names that success could not erase, and wounds that time refused to heal. Who were the actors Gordon Lightfoot truly hated, and which name might surprise you the most? Number 6. Joni Mitchell. In public memory, Gordon Lightfoot and Joni Mitchell are often placed side by side, 2 Canadian voices, 2 paths out of the folk tradition, 2 symbols of artistic freedom. But behind that convenient pairing lived a quiet tension that never softened with time. Joni Mitchell represented a generation determined to break away. She rejected what she saw as rigid structures in folk music, dismissing tradition as limitation rather than foundation. Her interviews were sharp, unapologetic, and often dismissive of the very scene that had carried Canadian songwriters into the world. To Lightfoot, this was not evolution. It was abandonment. He had built his career on respect for form, storytelling rooted in discipline, songs shaped slowly, deliberately, with reverence for the past. When Mitchell publicly distanced herself from traditional folk, Lightfoot took it personally, not as an insult, but as a betrayal of shared ground. In private conversations, he made it clear that innovation without loyalty meant nothing to him. The scandal here was never loud. No direct confrontation, no angry statements, but the distance was unmistakable. Invitations went unanswered. Praise was withheld. Where others celebrated Mitchell's boldness, Lightfoot remained silent, and that silence carried weight. For him, her rejection of folk was also a rejection of Canada's musical identity, exchanged for international validation. What deepened the rift was how history began to frame them. Mitchell was cast as the visionary, Lightfoot as the conservative. The implications stung. He did not see himself as backward. He saw himself as faithful, and he resented being positioned as an artifact, while others were crowned innovators. There was no reconciliation because there was no misunderstanding. They simply stood on opposite sides of a line neither was willing to cross. Mitchell moved forward by cutting ties. Lightfoot stayed rooted and watched the culture follow her. In the end, this was not hatred born of jealousy or rivalry. It was disappointment, a quiet, enduring disapproval towards someone who, in his eyes, walked away from something sacred. That was enough for Gordon Lightfoot to never look back. Number 5. Neil Young. To the outside world, Neil Young embodied success. A Canadian who conquered the American music industry, reinvented himself repeatedly, and spoke openly about freedom, rebellion, and artistic courage. For many, he was proof that talent from north of the border could dominate the global stage. For Gordon Lightfoot, he represented something far more troubling. Lightfoot never questioned Young's talent. What troubled him was the path he chose and what he left behind along the way. As Young's sound hardened and his identity shifted decisively toward American rock culture, Lightfoot felt a line had been crossed. Folk roots were no longer honored. Canada became a footnote. The songs grew louder, the statements bolder, but the sense of belonging quietly disappeared. The scandal was not a single moment, but a pattern. Young rarely acknowledged the folk foundations that shaped him. Interviews emphasized reinvention, not lineage. Tradition was treated as something to escape rather than preserve. To Lightfoot, this was not artistic growth, it was denial. And denial, in his moral code, bordered on betrayal. What made the tension sharper was how the industry responded. Neil Young was celebrated as fearless and uncompromising, while Lightfoot was increasingly framed as safe and conservative. The contrast felt unfair. Lightfoot had taken risks of his own, but he had done so without abandoning his roots. Watching Young receive praise for cutting ties stung deeply. Privately, Lightfoot grew resentful of what he saw as selective memory. Canada provided the soil. The American industry took the harvest. And the artist in between rarely looked back. There was no open conflict between them, but there was no warmth either. Any sense of shared identity quietly dissolved. In conversations late in life, Lightfoot spoke with disappointment rather than anger. He believed that success carried responsibility, not just to oneself, but to the culture that shaped you. In his eyes, Young had chosen reinvention over responsibility and applause over loyalty. That choice was unforgivable. For Gordon Lightfoot, Neil Young became a symbol of something he feared most in the music business: talent without roots, freedom without memory, a Canadian voice that no longer sounded like home. Number 4. Leonard Cohen. The tension between Gordon Lightfoot and Leonard Cohen was never visible on the surface. There were no sharp words exchanged in public, no dramatic ruptures, no definitive moment where one could say the relationship broke. Yet beneath the respect and the shared nationality existed a rivalry that neither man ever fully escaped. Cohen occupied a different space in the cultural imagination. He was framed as the intellectual, the poet, the dark philosopher of Canadian music. His lyrics were dissected, quoted, taught, elevated. Lightfoot, by contrast, was praised for craftsmanship, for clarity, for songs that spoke plainly to ordinary lives. Over time, that distinction hardened into a hierarchy, and Lightfoot felt it keenly. The scandal here was subtle but persistent. Media narratives repeatedly positioned Cohen as the deeper artist, the more complex mind, while Lightfoot was reduced to the role of traditional storyteller. Interviews, retrospectives, and academic discussions reinforced the idea that one wrote literature set to music, while the other simply wrote songs. Lightfoot resented this framing, not because he doubted Cohen's brilliance, but because it diminished his own. What made it worse was that the comparison was constant. Two Canadians, two songwriters, two icons of the same era. Every success for one became an implied judgment on the other. Lightfoot did not see himself as lesser, but he grew tired of being treated as simpler, safer, and more accessible, as if accessibility were a flaw rather than a strength. There was no personal betrayal between them, but there was a sense of displacement. Cohen's shadow loomed large, especially in cultural circles that valued abstraction over narrative. Lightfoot believed that honesty and restraint required just as much depth as irony and darkness, but that argument was rarely acknowledged. Privately, he rejected the idea that suffering needed to be theatrical to be meaningful. His songs carried loss, regret, and mortality in quieter ways. Yet those qualities were often overlooked in favor of Cohen's cultivated mystique. In the end, this was not hatred born of envy. It was resentment toward a system that insisted on comparison, that ranked artists rather than listening to them on their own terms. Cohen became the symbol of that imbalance, whether he intended it or not. For Gordon Lightfoot, the wound was not inflicted by a man, but by a narrative that never stopped measuring him against someone else. Number 3. Cat Stevens. When Cat Stevens emerged as one of the defining voices of introspective folk in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Gordon Lightfoot recognized something immediately. The emotional tone felt familiar. The restraint, the gentle authority, the way melodies carried meaning without spectacle. To many listeners, this was simply a shared sensibility. To Lightfoot, it felt uncomfortably close. The tension did not come from charts or sales. It came from influence and acknowledgement. Lightfoot had spent years refining a style built on narrative clarity and emotional economy. When Stevens rose quickly, drawing massive international attention for songs that echoed similar values, Lightfoot noticed how rarely his own name entered the conversation. The music press celebrated Stevens as a fresh voice, an original force, while treating the lineage that preceded him as irrelevant. The scandal here was never a lawsuit or a public accusation. It was the quiet erasure of influence. Lightfoot believed that Stevens had absorbed the spirit of North American folk storytelling without ever recognizing the artists who shaped it. In interviews, Stevens spoke of spiritual searching and personal reinvention, but he rarely spoke of the musical shoulders he stood on. That silence mattered. What deepened the resentment was how audiences responded. Stevens was praised for sincerity, vulnerability, and depth, qualities Lightfoot had embodied for decades. Yet suddenly, those traits were framed as discoveries rather than continuations. To Lightfoot, it felt like watching someone enter a room he had built and claim it as new. There was also a cultural imbalance at play. Stevens benefited from being positioned as an international figure, detached from national identity. Lightfoot, by contrast, was continually framed as Canadian first, universal second. The same qualities were judged differently, depending on who carried them. In private conversations, Lightfoot dismissed the situation with restraint, but the bitterness remained. He did not accuse Stevens of theft. He accused the industry of selective memory, of celebrating surface originality while ignoring roots, of rewarding reinvention while undervaluing consistency. When Stevens later withdrew from the music world, some saw it as spiritual courage. Lightfoot saw it differently. He saw a man who entered the tradition, took what he needed, and left without ever fully acknowledging where it came from. That absence of recognition was enough. For Gordon Lightfoot, Cat Stevens represented a deeper frustration with a music culture that rewarded the appearance of depth while quietly forgetting the artists who defined it first. Number 2. Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan stood at the center of modern folk mythology. He was praised as a revolutionary, a prophet, a figure who reshaped songwriting itself. For Gordon Lightfoot, that status was precisely where the resentment began. Not because Dylan lacked talent, but because the story built around him left no room for anyone else, especially those outside the American narrative. Lightfoot had long believed that Dylan's influence was amplified by geography as much as genius. The American industry elevated its own voices with unmatched force, often absorbing ideas, styles, and traditions from elsewhere, while presenting them as purely domestic breakthroughs. To Lightfoot, Dylan became the clearest example of that imbalance, a towering figure whose shadow obscured the contributions of others, particularly Canadian songwriters who shared similar roots. The tension deepened with recurring suspicions about borrowing. Dylan was no stranger to controversy over melodies, phrasing, and lyrical structures that echoed earlier folk traditions. While Lightfoot never accused him directly, he followed these debates closely. What troubled him was not the act of borrowing itself, but the refusal to acknowledge it. Folk music, in Lightfoot's view, was built on lineage and respect. Dylan's posture of constant reinvention often felt like denial of that lineage. There was also a personal dimension. Dylan's public persona carried an air of detachment, even dismissal, toward peers who did not fit his evolving image. Canadian artists, in particular, were rarely granted equal footing. Lightfoot sensed a quiet hierarchy, one in which Canada supplied influence but rarely received credit. Dylan became the symbol of that hierarchy, whether intentionally or not. As Dylan's legend grew, so did the contrast. He was hailed as enigmatic and fearless, while Lightfoot was described as steady and traditional. The implication was clear. One challenged the world, the other simply observed it. Lightfoot rejected that framing entirely. His songs carried history, labor, loss, and national memory. They did not need masks or mystique to matter. Privately, Lightfoot expressed frustration with how the industry rewarded attitude over accountability. Dylan's ability to move freely between styles, shedding past identities without consequence, felt like privilege rather than courage. It was a freedom Lightfoot never believed he was afforded. In the end, Bob Dylan represented more than a rival artist. He embodied a system that celebrated American voices while quietly marginalizing others. For Gordon Lightfoot, that imbalance was impossible to forgive. And that is why Dylan stood just one step away from the deepest wound of all. Number 1. Chris Christopherson. Of all the names Gordon Lightfoot carried with him into old age, this was the one that hurt the most. Not because of rivalry, not because of fame, but because trust was involved. Chris Christopherson was not a distant figure or a symbolic enemy. He was someone Lightfoot once respected deeply, someone he believed understood him. Christopherson emerged as a songwriter with unusual sensitivity, praised for his raw honesty and emotional directness. Lightfoot recognized that voice immediately. He saw a kindred spirit, a man who valued storytelling over spectacle, meaning over noise. In the early years, there was admiration, even a sense of shared purpose. They moved in overlapping circles. They spoke the same musical language. That is what made the fracture irreversible. As Christopherson's career accelerated, his public narrative began to change. Interviews focused on his originality, his singular vision, his role as a bridge between folk and country. What disappeared from that story were the influences that shaped him. Lightfoot noticed the omission, not once, but repeatedly. Conversations where his name might have been mentioned never arrived. Acknowledgement never came. The scandal was not a stolen song or a legal dispute. It was something colder, erasure. Lightfoot felt that Christopherson had quietly stepped past him, carrying pieces of his musical ethic without ever looking back. In private, Lightfoot described it as the deepest form of betrayal, not taking credit openly, but allowing history to forget who stood nearby. What intensified the pain was timing. Some of these moments occurred when Lightfoot was struggling physically and emotionally, watching others rise while his own world narrowed. He did not expect loyalty forever, but he expected honesty. And in that moment, he felt abandoned. Unlike other conflicts, this one closed every door. There was no reconciliation, no public exchange. Lightfoot simply withdrew. He stopped speaking about Christopherson altogether. And for a man who measured words carefully, that silence was final. In the end, this was not about competition or legacy. It was about dignity, about recognizing the people who helped shape you. Lightfoot believed that when success arrived, Christopherson chose distance over gratitude. That choice cut deeper than any insult. For Gordon Lightfoot, this was the name that never healed. In the end, Gordon Lightfoot did not speak to provoke outrage or to rewrite history. He spoke because silence had protected others for too long. These 6 names were not chosen out of bitterness, but out of clarity. They marked the moments when loyalty failed, when respect was withheld, and when integrity carried a personal cost. Lightfoot never needed revenge. Walking away was enough. His songs survived without explanation. Now, for the first time, the truth behind them stands quietly in the open. This is not anger remembered. It is memory reclaimed.